So the other day I went to see Wuthering Heights, and considering the promotional material, it went about as well as could be expected. Actually, no, thinking about it, it was somehow worse. My friend and I were sat in silence for a full 5 minutes after the film ended, just trying to process what we'd just seen. On paper, I should be the target audience for a Wuthering Heights adaptation. I'm an English lit and film student. I'd studied the novel before and really enjoyed it, and I love a good period drama. Some of my favourite films are period pieces. But this film was just so odd that it really got me thinking about the subgenre of the period drama in general. How has it been approached in the past? What makes a good one? What makes a bad one? And that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, in an effort to try and understand Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights. But before we get into all of that, I thought I'd define what I mean by period drama, or period piece, or historical drama. I'm going to be using the terms interchangeably, seeing as they essentially, for purposes of this video, they are the same thing. According to my credible source, Wikipedia, the period piece, or the historical drama, can be defined as a dramatic work set in the past, usually in the context of film and television, which presents historical events and characters with varying degrees of fiction, such as creative dialogue or scenes which compress separate events. That was unbelievably difficult to read, and I'm not sure why. One thing to note is that there's often an overlap with book to film adaptations and period dramas, and that's something that we'll obviously look at with Wuthering Heights, but also with another example I'll bring up in a minute. But also in the case of my second example, we'll get to it, the suspense, I know, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that the original text was written 200 years ago and is an established part of the literary canon. You'll see what I mean. I thought that today we could take a look at the period piece, how it's been approached in the past, and how these histories relate to Wuthering Heights and how it turned out the way that it did. And perhaps in this journey that we'll embark on together, I'll be able to, by the end of it, look on Wuthering Heights more kindly. Okay, let's start simple. Adapting a novel that's established itself as part of the literary canon, so to speak, and takes place in a very recognizable period of history. Period of history? Point in time. The point is, it looks historical, and we know it looks historical. Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, published in 1813, follows the five Bennet sisters. I'm gonna try and name them all off the top of my head. Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Kitty, and Lydia. Period. There we go. Period piece. Right. It follows these girls as they reckon with society and the prospect of finding husbands. So I actually watched the film before I read the novel, and I love both dearly, but for the purposes of this, I'm specifically talking about the 2005 adaptation. Though interestingly, as you will soon see, there is actually quite a lot of similarity between this adaptation and the novel. In terms of the narrative, it's virtually the same, apart from maybe a couple of social gatherings being missing, but after the first few balls you kind of get the idea anyway, and a couple of Bingley's companions are missing, but they don't add much to the novel anyway. No shade, but his only relevant sister really is Caroline, and she features in the film. Perhaps the biggest difference is that Elizabeth's subjectivity is missing from the film, but this is an element that doesn't translate super well between mediums anyway. So that's kind of just well, sacrifices must be made. I'm glad they didn't voice over. I don't think that would have fit, but that's just a difference that I noted. The main narrative beats are all there though. Lydia elopes with Wickham, Jane and Bingley have their situationship, and obviously Elizabeth and Darcy end up together. But what interests me most about this adaptation of Pride and Prejudice isn't necessarily how closely it matches the original narrative, but more so how it makes aesthetic choices that enable it to feign historical accuracy. Not necessarily feign makes it sound like trickery. Well, it's kind of trickery when you think about it. It's creating the illusion of historical accuracy while taking creative liberties that ultimately service the narrative. For example, the costumes aren't necessarily all historically accurate to the late 18th century setting, which itself is later than the novel was published, and a lot of previous Pride and Prejudice adaptations have gone with the sort of 1813 period rather than, I think, off the top of my head, I think this was meant to be set in like 1790 something, i.e. when Jane Austen's first manuscript, First Impressions, was or is guessed to have been written, vaguely. Is it confirmed? I don't know, I should probably fact check that. 1 second. Fact checking in the middle of my video. I should probably have done this sooner. Yes, it was 1796 roughly. The costume choices, in particular with regard to waistlines, aren't necessarily historically accurate, and were instead done to reflect character. With these fashion choices, the average spectator wouldn't necessarily notice that Elizabeth's clothing is from a different time period to her mother's, like several decades apart. There's still a level of historical basis present which contributes to the plausibility of these being costumes from a specific period of history, because they are, just not the same one. Another visual choice that I think really interestingly grounds the film in a specific period of history is the cinematography. I mean, there are certain shots in this film that remind me of something out of like a Caspar David Friedrich painting. Caspar David Friedrich was a romantic German painter, not like romantic as in romantic capital R, German painter, and this art movement is specifically tied to the period of history in which Pride and Prejudice is set, and I just think that's really cool. I don't know necessarily if this was a point of reference when the film was being made. Would probably have been something interesting to have looked up, but the thought just occurred to me now. But I think that mirroring an artistic movement that temporally lines up with the setting of the film is a really cool way of grounding your film in a specific period of history. Even if not every creative choice is 100% historically accurate, I think the key term here is plausibility. The fact that the film narratively so closely mirrors the original text contributes to this believability, and the result is a period drama that feels incredibly grounded in history, even if that's not entirely the case. On the next step of our journey through period dramas, I wanted to look at something that is less historically accurate and more obviously so. Personally, I like to view Bridgerton as a piece of speculative fiction, and while speculative fiction is most commonly used interchangeably with science fiction, I mean it in its most literal form. It's sort of a reimagining of the world that we live in, or once lived in. Although this society is recognisable at a glance as the one we were taught about in history lessons, Bridgerton poses a bunch of what-if questions that create a subtly fictionalised yet still somewhat believably historical backdrop for these narratives to unfold. The result is a utopic vision of Regency England without, the colonialism and racism and all of that stuff. I will say that I have seen some valid criticism about Queen Charlotte, the limited series spin-off about Queen Charlotte and how it handles the race element. Some think that it would have been more progressive to entirely not address race, but Queen Charlotte sort of explains how this society came to be racially accepting. And I do understand where this criticism comes from, but I also think that it's really interesting to address how this society came to be the way it is, because it poses some really interesting questions, particularly where gender equality and class structures are concerned. Bridgerton carefully and rather interestingly balances one move towards social equality against maintaining a social order and hierarchy that is so entrenched in particularly British society that it's still somewhat visible today. I mean, the most recent / current season of Bridgerton is all about social class, its structures and complexities, with the main romantic leads of the season being Benedict Bridgerton, a man is he of rank? Does this count? I don't actually know how Like, obviously Anthony's the Viscount, but what does that make Benedict? But he's a man of good birth and good social standing, and his romantic counterpart for the season is a servant girl who is the illegitimate daughter of a lord. This and the borrowing of the Cinderella story trope for their love story really centers class in this season. And a really interesting way that this is also done is the fact that we spend so much time with the servants and maids and whatnot over the course of this season. And this is the case even outside of the context of the romantic pairing. I mean, we get a little bit of Mrs. Varley's story with the Featheringtons, which I didn't expect, but I quite liked. I think the Featheringtons are a really interesting family. But that's me going off on a tangent, so we're gonna leave that there. Maybe I'll talk about Bridgerton again at some point, I don't know. I mean, the season even opens with the sequence following Mrs. Wilson managing the rest of the servants as they prepare for the arrival of Eloise, Francesca and John. And this really shows how season 4 centers and makes an effort to delve into class difference and its complexities and what that means for a society like the one that Bridgerton is set in. It really works to tether Bridgerton to a historical reality that it might start to stray from where costume is concerned, for example. Bridgerton doesn't pretend to be historically accurate, but it still retains its title as a period drama, borrowing elements from the Regency aesthetic and calling into question certain social attitudes that are so closely associated with the period. Bridgerton sees an act of negotiation rather than outright following or total rejection, which I think is a super valid and interesting way of approaching the period drama. And so we return to the film that has been puzzling me since before I even saw it. I mean, from the trailers and the sneak peeks and everything that we were given beforehand, it was made pretty clear, or, well, I say clear, it was alluded to that perhaps Wuthering Heights would stray from its source material. I, for one, am not someone who subscribes to the philosophy of unfaithful adaptation equals bad film. Take Percy Jackson, for example. Are those films accurate to the books? No, that's kind of like the only thing people talk about with them. Logan Lerman is not a 12-year-old boy. Percy Jackson should not have an iPod. But are those films entertaining as hell? Well, yes. I mean, how interesting the narrative is aside, which we'll talk about that in a moment. Where the inaccuracy of the novel, scratch that, reverse it. Where the inaccuracy of the film in relation to the novel starts to pose an issue is when the film doesn't seem to be able to decide whether it wants to be an adaptation that's faithful or a film that's loosely based on a novel. I mean, the fact that copies of Wuthering Heights are now being printed with the cover as the poster for the film speaks volumes in and of itself. The characters' names are all the same and the narrative is loosely similar, and what Emerald Fennell said that this is a version of Wuthering Heights that she read as a child. So it certainly seems that it wants to do the novel, kind of. But then the question is, what went wrong? To tie this to other period dramas that I've spoken about, let's look at Wuthering Heights from the Pride and Prejudice approach. These are both novels that have established themselves as part of the literary canon, but I've already mentioned how Wuthering Heights doesn't do what Pride and Prejudice does in terms of sticking to the narrative. I mean, for one thing, the entire second volume of the novel is missing, which I'm not mad about, let me be clear. It would have been like a massive task to try and include the second volume anyway. Anyone who's read Wuthering Heights will know this novel is narratively like, it's a lot to deal with, and I feel like adapting that would have resulted in like a 5-hour-long film. But the removal of a character like Hindley, for example, a character that is so integral to catalyzing Heathcliff's quest for revenge, is kind of a nonsensical omission to me that can't really be excused by trying to be conscious of runtime. Another way that Pride and Prejudice does the period drama is aesthetically. Wuthering Heights does not. While it's certainly an aesthetically interesting film, I could not tell you when this is meant to be set. I mean, it could be taking place anytime from 1700 to 2026. Like, I genuinely do not know. The first half hour of the film really seems like it's trying to ground itself in a kind of historical, not necessarily accuracy, but maybe a variant of a historical reality. But then we get to Thrushcross Grange with the Lintons, and that just gets thrown out the window. Like, okay, let's just say these are creative choices, and everyone is entitled to their artistic interpretation of any work of art. Like, that's fair. But one change that I can't excuse is the depiction of Heathcliff. Casting a white man, like Jacob Elordi aside, any white man as Heathcliff is a baffling choice to me. It removes so much from the text, and honestly this brings me on to another more general issue I have with the film, which is that I think if I had to describe what Emerald Fennell does with Wuthering Heights in one word, it would be flattening. Wuthering Heights is an unbelievably complex novel, both thematically and structurally. But Fennell's film sort of takes all of this multidimensionality and intricacy and makes it flat. This 2D-ness is obviously detrimental to the Wuthering Heights narrative, but it also affects its identity as a period piece. Consider the class conflict element that is arguably the most important thematic element of the novel. There's obviously the slight difference, or the more subtle difference, between the Earnshaws and the Lintons, but the obvious one is the difference between pretty much everyone else and Heathcliff. Race obviously plays an important role here, but if we're going to accept and move on from the fact that Emerald Fennell's film is Wuthering Heights, we're just going to focus on class for a moment here and see how that has been handled. Let's assume it's like the Bridgerton approach, but more problematic, taking aesthetic liberties and ignoring race to the point of erasure rather than diversity, but still handling class. In the original novel, Cathy says that it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff, and this is included in the film, but that's about as far as the class commentary goes. The original novel's revenge narrative is centered around Heathcliff's identity as the other, both in terms of race and class. When Heathcliff disappears for several years, he returns having acquired wealth and is able to buy the Heights, and appears to be a gentleman. But this doesn't negate his lower class origin. It remains an underlying factor that he wasn't born a wealthy white man, and this is part of what makes Emily Bronte's original novels so interesting, particularly from a modern perspective, where we are having, generally speaking, more nuanced conversations about race and class. While we aren't meant to excuse his villainous actions, we are able to sympathize with, or at least understand, the place that these actions are coming from. But when your class commentary is reduced to a single quote from the book, that nuance isn't really possible. The depth of both his character and the narrative on the whole are pretty much removed entirely. Now, I'm not necessarily certain that Emerald Fennell was the person to be conducting nuanced social commentary, considering both her background as well as how she's handled class in the past. Saltburn. Maybe I'll talk about Saltburn a different time, but let it be known I am not really a fan. But honestly, I would rather rewatch Saltburn 10 times than have to sit through Wuthering Heights again. That being said, I feel like a certain agreement is made when you commit to adapting a class-centric novel like Wuthering Heights. After looking at other period pieces and comparing and contrasting approaches to doing period dramas, it really all just begs the question, why didn't Emerald Fennell just title her film something else? Make a piece of art that is just entirely separate from Wuthering Heights, maybe say it was inspired by Wuthering Heights, or just direct a music video? I truly don't know. I mean, who am I to say whether an approach to filmmaking is right or wrong? But one thing I can say with certainty is that Wuthering Heights as a film left me baffled. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and leave a comment down below letting me know what you thought about Wuthering Heights. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.